They call it the dream of a united Ummah, a single military bloc stretching from Morocco to Indonesia, an Islamic NATO that could challenge global power structures. But the uncomfortable truth is that the idea collapses the moment it touches reality, because alliances are not built on religion, they are built on fear, power, and interests. And in the Islamic world today, those interests are deeply divided. Let's start with the most fundamental requirement for any military alliance: a common enemy. When NATO was formed in 1949, it wasn't about culture or religion, it was only about one thing: containing the Soviet Union. Every member, from the US to Western Europe, shared the same fear. That fear created unity, it created commitment, it made countries willing to go to war for each other. Now look at the Islamic world. Pakistan sees India as its primary threat. Saudi Arabia sees Iran as an existential rival. Iran sees the United States and Israel as its main enemies. Turkey is focused on Kurdish groups and regional dominance. Indonesia is largely inward-looking, concerned with domestic stability. These threat perceptions don't overlap. In fact, many of them directly contradict each other. So if one country is attacked, why would others respond? If Iran is attacked, will Saudi Arabia defend it? If Pakistan enters conflict with India, will Saudi Arabia send troops? If Turkey gets involved in the Mediterranean, will Arab states intervene? The answer in almost every case is no. And without that willingness, the core principle of collective defense simply cannot exist. Now let's go deeper. The biggest fracture isn't geopolitical, it's ideological. The Sunni-Shia divide is not just a theological disagreement, it's a geopolitical fault line running across the Middle East. On one side, you have Sunni powers like Saudi Arabia and its allies, and on the other side, you have Shia-led Iran. This divide has already played out in multiple conflicts: Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon. These are not diplomatic disagreements, these are proxy wars. In Yemen, Saudi Arabia and Iran backed opposing sides. In Syria, Iran supported the Assad regime, while Turkey and Gulf states supported rebel factions. So ask yourself, how do you build a military alliance among countries that are already fighting with each other indirectly? You don't and you can't, because alliances require trust, and trust cannot exist when members see each other as threats. But even if you somehow ignore sectarian divisions, another problem emerges: leadership. Who leads this so-called Islamic NATO? Saudi Arabia, because it has wealth and religious significance, or Turkey, because of its military strength and Ottoman legacy, or Pakistan, because it has nuclear weapons, or maybe Iran, because of its ideological influence and regional networks. Each of these countries sees itself as a leader, and none of them is willing to follow the other. This isn't just rivalry, it's a clash of visions. Saudi Arabia wants to lead the Islamic world through economic power and religious authority. Turkey is pushing a neo-Ottoman vision of regional influence. Iran is building a resistance axis against Western influence. These visions don't align, they compete. And when leadership is contested, alliances fracture before they even form. Now consider another layer: dependence on external powers. Many Muslim majority countries are not strategically independent. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states rely heavily on the United States for security. American military bases are spread across the region. Weapon systems, intelligence networks, and defense infrastructure are deeply integrated with Western systems. Turkey is already a NATO member. Pakistan has long depended on both the United States and China for military and financial support. So if an Islamic NATO were to emerge, it would directly conflict with these existing relationships. So would Saudi Arabia risk its security umbrella for the US? Would Turkey leave NATO to join a new bloc? Would Pakistan put its economic lifeline at risk? Highly unlikely. Because in geopolitics, survival comes before symbolism. Then comes the Iran paradox, the fatal contradiction at the heart of this idea. Any meaningful Islamic alliance must include Iran. It's too large, too influential, too strategically important to ignore. But including Iran could create immediate problems. Gulf states would resist, the United States would oppose, internal divisions would deepen. On the other hand, excluding Iran could create a different problem. The alliance loses credibility, It becomes a Sunni bloc rather than a truly Islamic one. So the alliance is stuck in a paradox: include Iran and have an internal conflict, exclude Iran and have a loss of legitimacy. Either way, the structure becomes unstable. Now let's shift focus to economics and military imbalance. Not all countries bring equal value to the table. The Gulf states are extremely wealthy, but they rely heavily on imported military systems and foreign expertise. Pakistan has a strong military and a nuclear weapons, but struggles economically. Turkey has a relatively balanced profile, but is regionally focused. Many African and Southeast Asian Muslim majority countries have limited military capacity. So who would fund the alliance? Who would lead military operations? And who would provide troops? These questions create frictions. Even within NATO, burden sharing is a constant issue. The United States carries a disproportionate share of defense spending. Now imagine that problem in a far more divided and unequal group. It becomes unmanageable. Geography makes things worse. The Islamic world is not a compact region. It has its presence across continents: North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. This creates logistical nightmare. Moving troops, coordinating operations, maintaining supply lines, all becomes extremely complex. NATO works partly because its members are geographically connected, allowing for rapid deployment and coordination. An Islamic NATO would be spread too thin, too far apart, and too disconnected. Then there is an issue of political systems. You're dealing with monarchies like Saudi Arabia, military-influenced states like Pakistan, theocracies like Iran, and democracies like Indonesia. Each system has different priorities, different decision-making processes, and different definition of legitimacy. In a crisis, who would make decisions? Who has a final say? And how quickly can they respond? Without political alignment, military coordination becomes nearly impossible. Another critical factor is something called fear of entrapment. Countries are cautious about alliances because they don't want to be dragged into conflicts that don't concern them. For example, if Pakistan is in conflict with India, why should Morocco get involved? If Iran escalates against Israel, why should Indonesia risk war? If Turkey clashes in the Mediterranean, why should Gulf states intervene? This fear prevents deep military commitments. Countries prefer flexibility over obligation, and that kills the idea of binding alliance. Now zoom out and look at identity. There's a popular belief that religion can unify nations politically, but history shows otherwise. The concept of Ummah is powerful emotionally, but in practice, nationalism dominates. A Saudi identifies as Saudi first. A Turk identifies as Turkish first. A Pakistani identifies as Pakistani first. National interests override religious identity. And without a shared political identity, alliances remain superficial. There is also historical precedent to consider. This isn't the first time such idea has been proposed. Efforts like CENTO and CETO tried to create a regional alliance involving Muslim-majority countries, but they failed. Even the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which represents Muslim-majority countries globally, has struggled to move beyond symbolic cooperation. It has no unified military structure, no collective defense mechanism, and limited strategic impact. If smaller, simpler alliances failed, then why would a larger, more complex one would succeed? Finally, consider the role of external powers. A unified Islamic military bloc would control the critical global choke points, like the Strait of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb. It would influence global energy markets, it would possess nuclear capability through Pakistan, and it would shift the balance of power significantly. This is not something the major powers would ignore. The United States, Europe, China, and Russia all have strategic interest in preventing such consolidation, not necessarily through direct opposition, but through influence, alliances, and balancing strategies, because a fragmented region is easier to manage than a unified one. So what does all this lead to? The idea of Islamic NATO doesn't fail because it lacks ambition. It fails because it lacks alignment. No common enemy, deep internal rivalries, competing leadership ambitions, dependence on external powers, economic and military imbalance, geographical fragmentation, political incompatibility, fear of entrapment, and weak shared identity. Each of these factors alone is a challenge. Combined, they make the idea structurally unworkable. What you might see instead is limited cooperation, like joint exercises, intelligence sharing, and counterterrorism coordination. But a full-scale, NATO-style alliances with collective defense, well, that would require a level of unity that simply doesn't exist today, and it might not exist even in the future. And until those underlying realities change, the idea will remain what it is now. Not a strategy, not a structure, but a slogan. If you found this analysis insightful, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.